Lots to talk about in relation to the lockdown and indeed Greensill. We're going to talk to the former chairman of the Committee on Standards and Public Life, Sir Alistair Graham, to get his thoughts on the latest on the Cameron Mandarin snared by lobbying scandal. That's the front page of the Daily Mail today. Top Cameron Mandarin took job from Greensill is the Times, and revealed top civil servant's role at scandal hit Greensill in the Guardian. It's all over. There's going to be a vote in the House of Commons later. Well, let's ask my next guest, Sir Iain Duncan Smith, about this, former Conservative Party leader. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Obviously, lots to talk to you about in terms of lockdowns and obviously COVID. But this front page story, pretty much across the board now, this call from Labour for inquiry into the Greensill and David Cameron lobbying scandal. Questions about whether Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, Matt Hancock were closely involved, but also the fact that this, extraordinarily, this very senior civil servant, Bill Crothers, was working for 3 months as a government procurement head, basically in charge of procuring business from the private sector, and at the same time was being paid by the Greensill board as an advisor for 3 months of that time, and that was apparently allowed and approved by the Cabinet Office, was in the rules. As Rachel Reeves says, this is a mind-blowing conflict of interest, is it not?
Yeah, I must say I've only just, like many others in this programme, discovered the issue about the official, the civil servant who was working for Greensill. I was racking my brains looking back to see whether or not I had recalled anything like that being agreed previously when I was in government, and I can't think of a case like this. I can think of where people from the civil service were seconded to various businesses for a year or two, and then they came back. That was essentially, as I understand it, to give them greater experience about how business works, etc., but not somebody who was involved in procurement, part-time, involved in another company, and then eventually sliding off without any requirement that they have no further involvement for over 2 years, which was always, I considered, to be the reality. So this needs to be looked at. I think Bernard Jenkin, who had been the chairman of this particular committee, not overseeing it, but the parliamentary committee, has also recommended that there is a root and branch review about what happens to ministers and to civil servants in the period just after they leave.
It's very damaging, though, isn't it? It's one thing, a rather complicated affair involving a former prime minister set to make some money, a business that most of us never heard of going under. But it's quite another thing when we're looking at people being paid by the taxpayer to get good value for money for taxpayers, procuring business with the private sector, being paid by a private sector company trying to get that business at the same time, and everyone apparently in government saying, well, that's just fine. It does smack of a sort of yes minister, jobs for the boys, we're all at the right, everyone goes to the right club, everyone went to the right boarding school together, sort of sleaze, doesn't it?
Well, things are divided into two parts. One is, did anything untoward happen? And secondly, is it perceived to have happened? And the perception is as important, in a sense, as the reality. So there is clearly perception here, and this needs to be dealt with. Whether or not there's reality, we'll discover. But I think any inquiry the government undertakes needs to be, I think, pretty broad-ranging, and it must be about what's wrong. And the questions that others are raising about the individual, there may be questions about somebody who's too close to government doing this.
Well, indeed. So you would support the Labour motion for a parliamentary committee to actually look into this, an inquiry, rather than a government-appointed lawyer?
Well, actually, there's no reason why a parliamentary committee can't look into this anyway. So there's nothing to stop them. So this vote as an either or is not a reality. The truth is Parliament can set up its own committee and it can call witnesses, and I believe it will do that.
OK. Let's get back to the issue in hand for which is affecting more people more immediately in their lives, and this is the ongoing lockdown. I'm fascinated by the people who think that we're no longer in lockdown when millions of people still unable to go to their workplaces, the hundreds of thousands of businesses still not open, and even those that have been reopened, the shops on Monday, and of course hospitality, most hospitality actually still not able to open, and also not able, even when they do, to be able to break even because they're only outdoors. The Prime Minister has once again in an interview said he will not speed up the rollout of the easing of the lockdown rules. And interestingly, he's also said that he believes that it is the lockdown that has meant that we have seen falling numbers of infections and hospitalisations and deaths, and not, he said it's not been achieved by the vaccination programme. He was quite categoric in that. He said that obviously has played a role, but the bulk of the work in reducing the disease has been done by the lockdown. Do you think he's right?
Well, I was a little surprised about the way in which this was said yesterday, to be fair. Yes, of course, in the early stages, the lockdown, before people were vaccinated for anything like the numbers that have been vaccinated back in January, of course, it was the lockdown that had probably the biggest impact at that particular stage. But as the vaccinations have rolled out, and we're now at something like 60%, I understand, of adults in the UK population that have now had at least one dose of the vaccine, then you've got the health secretary saying that this has saved 10,000 or more lives. And I think, therefore, the reality was at the beginning, maybe, and certainly the lockdown had an effect. I think Professor Spiegelhalter was on. I heard him earlier on today saying that it was in the early stages, definitely the lockdown, but it's clear now that the vaccines, and that's what we must believe, mean that we are saving lives because of the vaccines, and they will be the greatest defense against another wave, or at least a wave that can be contained and very few people may die. That, coupled with the fact that I saw today the ONS has now said something which I've always been deeply suspicious about, which is the death rate, which I've always believed was overstated because it became too easy if somebody had COVID just to mark them down as a COVID death. What the ONS is now saying is about a quarter of those
23%
didn't die. Yeah, they didn't die of COVID. They may have had COVID.
They died with COVID, and they counted because they had a positive. Well, they've died after a positive test within the last 28 days. Now, we saw that those stats actually were changed originally. Professor Carl Hennigan of Oxford University pointed out that someone sort of 6 months after having COVID, having recovered absolutely fine, getting knocked down by a bus, would still, on the previous way we'd counted deaths in last summer, have been a COVID death. That got changed down to within 28 days. But we know again and again, a huge number of the deaths were people who were in a care home with very unwell, with a huge number of underlying conditions at the end of their lives, in hospital with being already treated for a number of serious conditions. Something like 20%, in some hospitals 30% of those testing positive for COVID, testing positive after a couple of weeks in hospital. So therefore they've caught it in hospital. They're in hospital with a serious illness already, and yet they've still counted as a COVID death once they've got that positive test. A lot of people have been very unhappy with some of these statistics for a very long time.
Yes, and I think they will need to be looked into very carefully now so that we get a much better idea about the effect of coronavirus and exactly who are the vulnerable. And that is why I come back to the point made early on, which is that there's no question that we either believe in the vaccines or we don't. If we believe the vaccines stop, and the figures show up to 99% now, they believe vaccines are effective against coronavirus, stopping it, and also stopping the spread, by the way, of coronavirus, then if we believe that, then we must begin to recognize that it is possible to live in a world with coronavirus, but as long as people are vaccinated, people are safer. And I think we must plan around that process rather than keep saying we're going to have to keep locking down, because that will be a disaster for people's well-being as well as for their livelihoods.
I'm amazed by how many people keep saying, well, it's the last lockdown, so it's okay. The Prime Minister said it would be irreversible. He has said repeatedly he hopes it will be irreversible. At any point could reverse it. A lot of people, perhaps, we're getting a bit more cynical in our old age after being told so many different things over the last year. A lot of people think that what the Prime Minister had to say yesterday is not just back covering ahead of a public inquiry, if and when it ever happens, in terms of saying, well, this is huge damage to people's livelihoods and lives, the economy, and indeed the health. If you've got any health problem other than COVID, has been justifiable. It was worth it because it was what brought down the deaths, as opposed to the vaccination rollout, which could have been done without a lockdown. But also setting us up for possibly future lockdowns in the autumn. We know that case numbers, no matter how successful a vaccine, case numbers will go up in the autumn. It's a seasonal disease. We will see some more deaths. Chris Whitty, Patrick Vallance, Sage, Prime Minister have all been open about that. And yet it seems like we're being set up for justifying another lockdown in the future.
Yes, I wrote about this the other day, and I said that we've got to get back to dealing with what's called the balance of risks. Of course, coronavirus will be with us, and of course it will continue to pose a risk. Flu does. People die of flu. Quite significant numbers die of flu every year, although this year, because of the way that people have behaved, it hasn't taken its grip that it might normally have done. But the reality is what we do is we balance that against the need to keep things moving and to ensure that people can go about their daily lives in the best way that they possibly can. And I think it's that which we now need to think carefully through going forward. I don't blame in any way people for being cautious, for the science advisors, etc. That's their job. And for the Prime Minister, quite rightly, doesn't want to gamble when he needs certainty. Now, there is certainty. It's called the vaccine.
Yep.
Will it stop everything? Absolutely not. There'll be people that haven't taken it, and there'll be some people where they needed a booster, they didn't get it, all that. And there may be some other variants that briefly have an effect beyond the ability of the vaccines, or at least the total ability. All of those things can and probably will happen. But the key question is the balance of risks versus what we do if we just lock down again, and other health issues, mental health issues, problems over health treatments, and importantly, the economy. And I was arguing with somebody the other day about hospitality and said, oh, well, hospitality is just about people enjoying themselves. I said, no, it's not. There are millions of people who work in the hospitality sector who are low paid, and for this, they've been unable to be supported properly during the period of this pandemic. It's vital we get hospitality going because their jobs and livelihoods affect their well-being and their health.
Absolutely.
So there's a balance of risks we've got to get right.